Hi all, we're going to discuss Unit 6 of the class. Our main goal at Unit 6 is to create a GUI interface. We're going to use a drag and drop GUI Builder. We're going to end up with a program that would be suitable to run on, say, a PC. Might get away with using them on tablets as well. Last week we discussed the whole theory of user experience and GUI designs and things like consistency and all that good stuff. So this week we're going to have an opportunity to apply them. You have a lot of discretion in what you want to build, what kind of a GUI, what you would like it to do. If you would like, you can base it on the wireframe you created in Unit 5, but that's optional. Pretty much any GUI that you would like to create that meets the Unit 6 requirements will be fine. We'll discuss those in just a second. So if you read the Unit 6 assignment, you'll see that you're supposed to turn in 3 pieces. Part A is a data validation plan. Part B is the working GUI. And Part C is to review the data types for each field and explain your rationale for each type. Now, the way I would like you to turn this in, I think it makes sense. I don't think the instructions are all that clear on how to do this, but I think this will make sense. I don't think it'll create a lot of extra work on your part, and I think it'll be much more straightforward for me to give you the grade that you earn. I'd like you to turn in a single document that has Part A, then has a screenshot of Part B, and then has a further write-up, some more prose that does Part C, right? In addition to this document, I want to see your code that you produced. So all in all, what I'm looking for is a zip file that has the document I just described, the Part A, B, C document, and a folder with your code. Zip that all up together. That will be just fine. Data validation plan, mostly you're going to talk about your user inputs and how to validate them, and that depends on what you decide to put on your screen, what you want your GUI to do. For example, if you have an age field, you want to validate that. Some obvious choices are if it's an age, we'll assume it's an age in years, for example. You want to make sure it's numeric. Doesn't make a lot of sense to have an age like 6B or B37, something like that. We want it to be numeric. We probably want to decide that it's going to be an integer. I know it makes some sense to say I'm 5.5 years old, but mostly we don't want to do that. If you want to do that, that's fine, but make a deliberate decision and be able to explain why you're allowing a fraction in your age, right? So we want it to be numeric, probably an integer. We also probably want to put some kind of a range on it. It doesn't have to be a tight range. Mostly we're just looking if someone makes a keying area and accidentally types an extra digit or 0, has the key repeat or something. You know, they're trying to say 38 and they hold the 8 key down too long and they get 388. So we want to pick a range that's reasonable. That's probably 0 to, let's talk age, 0 to maybe 130 or 150 if you like more round numbers, okay? That way if they have this keying mistake, it's not a problem. There's a famous case of where someone at Amazon was entering information for a book that should have been like $17 in some sense, and they made a keying error, and it ended up being, you know, $1,700 and something. You know, they missed the decimal point. Instead of like 1776 as 1,776. Would have been nice to catch that and at least say, are you sure? But to make things a little simpler for us, we'll just say, well, if it doesn't validate, it's not valid, and we'll throw it out. A little dangerous because occasionally Amazon has some pretty pricey things, but in general we can kind of estimate that. We might be a little bit clever about it and say it's something based on what Amazon paid for the good and figure it won't won't mark it up more than a certain amount. That's getting a little more sophisticated than what we really need. But with an age, something like 0 to 150 would probably be fine. Give it a range. Negative age doesn't make any sense. We can rule that out. Age over 150, we can probably rule that out. You can make it a little tighter if you want, but 150 is safe, right? Or another example, you might have an email field. Well, we could in theory go out and really validate that it was a working email somehow. You could do a DNS lookup. It's domain name system. It's the way we look up addresses and URLs on the internet. That's more than we want to do too, but we can make sure that, for instance, there's an @ sign in it and say, well, if it doesn't have an @ sign, you're not giving us the whole thing. We can look in the part to the right of the @ sign and look for a period, because pretty much everything has at least one period. Of course, it could be allowed to have more than one, right? If you wanted to be a little more involved, although this is becoming dangerous, you could say, well, after the last period, you'll notice the last period, not just any period, after the last period, it should have 3 letters, and they should either be com, edu, org. For a long time, there were about 10 of those that were the only valid ones. Recently, though, they've started allowing a lot more. That part of the email address is called the domain. They've started to allow a lot more domains. And I know Amazon just got one, so they'll be able to have legitimate addresses that end in .amazon instead of .com. So that starts to become hard to validate. There are probably lots of people out there that put a lot of effort into validating that domain name, and now that they've loosened the rules on it, they're excluding email addresses that are perfectly valid, and they're probably getting beaten up for it. And so at this point, you're tempted to throw your hands up and just say, well, I'll just try anything they put in. That's not a good approach either. There's a good middle ground at which we catch the most common errors, particularly keying mistakes, things where I either repeat a key or where I miss a key. I pressed a key, but I didn't press it quite hard enough. It didn't register. Those are what we want to keep. If someone's gone to the trouble to type in .amazon, they probably mean it, and we should probably just take their word for it. Length validation is another good example. Things like a zip code, they can only, in the US, they can only be 5 long unless you do 9-digit zip codes, in which case they have to be 9 long. But they're either 5 long or they're 9 long. The other choices aren't valid. And in general, for stuff like that, you want to put the box on the screen, the field on the screen, so they can't type in too many. If you're going with 5-digit zip codes, there's no point in letting them even enter more than 5 digits. You're just allowing the user to do the wrong thing. And we discussed under heuristics last week, we discussed how we want to try to keep the user out of trouble and not just wrap their fingers when they get in trouble. So those boxes should be the right length. There are other ways you could do this. Like I assumed they were typing an age in, but you can put a little widget in that lets them have a little up and down arrow to increase or increment or decrement a digit. That way they can't put the wrong thing in. I find them to be a little tedious, but maybe you would like that. In theory, you could put a slider in there and slide to the right name, the right age. I don't know that that's a great choice, particularly for something that's integer, but you could do that. You could certainly make an argument for it. There are some things where we know it's a choice of particular things, and you're much better off giving them some kind of a pop-down or a radio button, something along those lines where they can only pick what you want. That can be a little dangerous these days too. But in general, if you're set up like if you have 3 or 4 categories of students, maybe you have full-time student, part-time student, graduate student, something like that, where you have 2 or about a dozen choices. Rather than have them guess at what you want them to fill into a text box, you can just have a pull down that gives them their choices and let them decide which one is most applicable to them. Now, if there's some way for you to look it up, you should just look it up and say, hey, we think you're a part-time student. No point in even making them fill something in. Okay, so that's part A, is you want to discuss how you're going to validate data. Each thing that you put on the screen, you're going to want to discuss why you did it. If you ask for a name, if you ask for an address and it's optional, tell whether it's required or optional. Is this field required? If this field optional? If you have required and optional fields, how does the user know whether something's required? Some people put like a little red asterisk next to something that's required. Some people make the label different. Maybe it's bold or italic or something. Whatever it is that you think is appropriate, explain what you're doing, right, and why you're doing it. If you're going to make the mailing address required, say, part of this project is we're going to send paper brochures or paper bills or whatever to the user. We need a good mailing address, so it's required. If you're not going to do that, don't require it. If you're not going to email the user, don't require their email. If you're not going to phone call the user, don't require a phone number. All right? You're just asking for making extra work for the user. So explain for each data item. Say why you're asking for it. Is it required? Is it optional? What kind of data is? Is it numeric? Is it an integer? Does it have a length requirement? Does it have a range? If it's an email address and you're looking for an @ sign when you discuss email, say since this is an email address, to be a valid email, it has to have an @ sign. It has to have at least one dot to the right of the @ sign. Because otherwise we know it's not valid and we're trying to catch user problems before they have to go back and change them, right? Explain through it. You're supposed to write a couple of pages, so don't feel like you're writing too much. Okay? Part B, take a screenshot of the GUI. We'll show you what kind of GUI you end up with. That should be very easy. If you're going to have to run to see if your code works, taking a screenshot is not a lot of extra effort. Go ahead and paste it into your document. That way we have your whole project together in one place. And then part C, really I described most of what you want in part C as part of part A. So you can split those up as you want, but be sure that you have both. Right, be sure it's obvious to me. It'd be better to explain the rationale for the types down here in part C than what I just told you. Same idea. Okay. We discussed turning in this one document plus your code. So now I'm going to take a little detour. They'll be of interest to some of you and not others. Sorry about that. I worked through this project in advance to be sure there weren't any problems. And I'm using Java this semester. In theory, I should be doing it with all three, but frankly, the Java is sucking down enough of my time that I'm sort of reluctant to try to buy into all three. Now, the good news for you .NET people is while I'm not covering it, you C# people, Visual Studio does a much better job integrating this than Eclipse does. Visual Studio, the GUI Builder is just built on in. You don't have to set it up specially or do anything. You just take a different screen option and you're there. Boom. And the Visual Studio GUI Builder is known for being about the best that there is out there. It's been very successful, and so that's great. I know there's a company in Madison, Wisconsin that does what's known as the best medical management software, the record-keeping part and hospital administration part. They're the best in the world. I want to say their name is Eclipse, and that's wrong. It's escaping me at the moment what their name is. But at any rate, it's interesting because I've talked to them some, and all their ad listings, they really avoid mentioning the programming language they used. And I finally just asked them, point out what programming language do you use? It just seems so mysterious. Well, in the back end, they have a somewhat obscure server database system based on a language called mumps. And there's a whole history to mumps, but it was designed for medical records, and I won't get into that. And then their front end is done in Visual Studio. Technically, it's with Visual Basic instead of C#, but frankly, once you're in Visual Studio, it doesn't really matter much which one you do. And they said, the GUI Builder is really good. In the front end, all it does is put together a GUI and hand a database request back to the back end. So the language really doesn't matter much. It's a matter of understanding the GUI builder. But we don't want to advertise. We want people that know this GUI builder, you know. So you see sharp people, you're going to have very little effort on getting your tools set up, and that's going to be a really good thing for you. I haven't looked at the how you do this with a web language. I think it's not much different than what you've been doing so far. I don't know that there's really a builder. There might be. Haven't gotten that far. I spent my time trying to get Java to work, and it took me about 12 hours to get that to happen. Now, Visual Studio, being such a great tool, sounds great, but it has its own limitations. I'll just mention some of them. It's designed to produce software to run on Windows boxes. So, for instance, if you need a GUI for Macintosh, you can generate that in this Eclipse code we're about to undertake, but you really can't generate that from Visual Studio. So there's just more flexibility with the tool because it's not locked down to Microsoft and Windows. At any rate, let's push on and start talking about actually doing the Java. And I will tell you, to be really honest, that I didn't find this unit's readings to be particularly helpful. The Dytel reading for Java, for example, spent a lot of time mentioning different widgets. That's okay if you need a summary of widgets. Really didn't discuss the tools we're using particularly. However, I did find the video for this week for Java, and there's one for C# as well. That was much more straightforward. But the graphical user interface -Java I thought was on the whole excellent. I would start by watching that. I think that may have been the best video I've seen out of the Purdue Global stuff. Having said that, I'll mention that it's not real new. So it's using an older version of the tools than we have now. They're close enough that you can follow it okay. That's not so much the problem. I'll tell you about the issues I had. I had problems getting some things installed. So basically you start with Eclipse, and Eclipse is extremely modular, which is good and it's bad. It's good, and if you have the right modules, you can make Eclipse do darn near anything. It's a little problematic in that each of those modules has its own life cycle with its own release schedule, and there's quite a bit of work to integrate it. A few years ago, and I don't know that they're still in business, a few years ago there was a company whose business model is they offer to come into your company and interview your programmers and then configure Eclipse with optional modules and such in such a way that it was a particular fit for what your developers were doing. And they charge companies $1,000 per programmer for this service, which suggests something about that. It took me in round terms about 12 hours getting this to work, okay? Your mileage may vary. You may do a lot better than I did. Hopefully my advice here will help shorten that up for you somewhat. So basically the goal here is there are 3 optional modules: Swing Designer, SWT Designer, and Window Builder that you want to add in and install. And the video does a very nice job explaining how to do that. Now, the video is for an older version of Eclipse. The version of Eclipse, the video did say that you had to be using Eclipse EE, that would be Enterprise Edition. That's not true, although we'll need EE for some future assignments. So if you have to do a reinstall, you might as well reinstall EE instead of Eclipse for Java developers. Okay. I won't walk through the installation, but I'll tell you my saga. So the video is a bit older. My version of Eclipse is a version I had installed last summer. Eclipse does a major release once a year during the summer, and I try not to destabilize it. I don't want things to stop working in the middle of my face semesters, so I try to stick it out with that version that I downloaded the previous summer. And so I had a version I downloaded last summer. Now, when I got to install these modules, it only shows you the version of the modules that will work with your version of Eclipse, which seems like a good thing. So in particular, okay, my version of Eclipse is Photon 4.8.0. The video was older, so I assumed I would be good. I'd have a newer version. And you can only pick the newest compatible for that module with your base Eclipse, which seems reasonable. But then only offered me version 1.9.0 of Window Builder. When I ran it to create the GUI Builder to create my screen, it blew up. I Googled around on the web, and it turned out that version 1.9.0 had a bug. I found that on Stack Overflow, and that they said that version 1.9.1 would work. However, I couldn't figure out how to get my version of Eclipse to load 1.9.1, so I decided to start over. I started by downloading the most current version of Java. I mean, I figure if you're going to do it, let's do it. So I downloaded Java 12. Then I downloaded the most current version of Eclipse. I went ahead with the EE version. It's free, and you'll need EE in future units. So while we're installing, we might as well do that. With the newest Eclipse EE, I then went in to add the optional modules. And when I got to Window Builder, it wanted me to use 1.9.2. And I figured, well, if 1.9.1 fixed a bug, 1.9.2 is probably okay. So I went with this, and it carried me past where I previously blew up. It got me to the screen where you drag and drop GUI widgets to create your screen, which the other one blew up trying to go into that step. I followed the instructions in the video, and I built a similar screen. I put about 5 labels in, about 5 fields in, and a submit button. That all went very nicely. And I ran it, and it blew up. So I started simplifying it, and eventually what I found is that if I took what it gave me and put nothing on the GUI and ran it, it was okay. But the first step that the video has you do, it makes perfect sense, is to add a layout tool, right? A layout manager, which you need. A layout manager, I don't know if you've hand coded or have other GUI experience, but the layout manager decides what order the fields and buttons happen in. You might think, oh, well, I'll just tell it where I want it. It's not quite that simple, of course, because people change the size of their windows all over the place, right? Even if we all had the same size PC screen, which we don't, people can resize their windows, people can minimize their windows, people have tablets, people have cell phones. It's a real problem to try to write a different version of the software for each different window size, right? So we want them to automatically adjust, and they do. Even in C# running Microsoft's version of windowing, they do. With Java adapting different environments, it's even more so. That's great, but what it means is we have to have some software that says, oh yeah, when the screen changes size, this is how I change everything. I make things bigger, I put more space between them. There are various things that we do. Layout managers control how that works. So I picked the layout manager that the video suggested, and it blew up. And I eventually got to the point where I realized if I had nothing on the window, it ran. If I had the GUI Builder, or if I had the layout manager but no buttons, it blew up. So clearly the problem was my layout manager. So I then tried again, and I started trying other layout managers, and I tried 3 of them, and all 3 of them worked. The video mentions the absolute layout manager. That puts things, lets you put things exactly where you want them. That sounds good, except I'm not sure how it behaves as you change the window size, but it doesn't blow up, so that's a good start. There's one called Flow. Flow puts one after the other. That can be useful in a simple screen. It's probably not what you want, but I was like, you know, let's start simple and see if that works. That did. Then I tried something called Grid Bag, and Grid Bag worked fine for me. Grid Bag looks very similar to what the video was trying to get it to do with a different layout manager. I would suggest that you go with grid bag. Once I picked the grid bag, I could then build the screen and the video without any real problems, and so I would recommend that. Okay, I'm going to try to walk through and show you. I've already got the modules installed. I'm going to try to show you what that looks like, okay? And this is not going to be vastly different than the video. First off, once you put the optional modules in, you get a new little widget up here at the top of the screen of Eclipse, right? You're used to this one over here, which gives you a choice of different kinds of projects, and that's still there. But then you get additional kinds of project choices related to your optional modules, including doing GUIs. And so I'm going to create a new project. Since I'm planning on posting this onto YouTube, I'm going to call this the YouTube version. And so I'm going to drop down here to swing, and under the swing dialog I'm going to take JFrame. JFrame does the window as opposed to a piece of window that JPanel or JDialog or JApplet would do. So I'm going to pick JFrame, and oh, the source folder name is empty. Okay, I missed a step. Bummer. What need I to do? I need to create my folder. So I need to do, let me see here. If I take other on the projects, and for projects I take, what do I take? And I'm going to pause you for a second while I figure out where I goofed. Well, that was silly. I need to have a Java project to work with. So let's go create a Java project. And that looks a little different on EE than what I'm used to. But here it is. And we'll do a next. And I'm going to call this the YouTube Unit 6. Not a great name, perhaps, but it should work for us. Yeah, and I think I want to say don't create. I don't like working with Java modules. They're an extra level of grouping that I don't typically need. So now that I've got a Java project, now I can come here and I can take swing and I can take JFrame and I can give it a name. How about YT for YouTube Unit 6 GUI? You can call it whatever you want. And we'll take finish. And it's generating a bunch of code. Now this is one of the places where GUI builders shine, because they're full of code that's very boring to write. Basically everything on the screen needs all these objects. That's actually much better than it used to be. I once did a couple of GUIs in X Windows back before they had O languages. They were written in straight C, and they were really difficult. It's difficult enough with objects, but we would like to do better than just the objects. So that generates some code for us, which is a fine start, but we would like to do some more without doing a lot of code writing. So I'm going to click Design here. It's going to open the design page, and once it gets this page open, you're going to see the magic. And at this point, it's going to start looking like the Visual Studio experience again as well. Come on, open. I had this work just a couple of days ago, so I'm going to be really cheat if it doesn't open. There we go. Oh, ye of little faith, just as I was starting to worry about it. Okay, so this is a typical kind of drag and drop GUI builder. You can see it shows us a window here. This is what a default JFrame looks like. It's going to take care of our buttons to kill the window, minimize it, stuff like that. Okay. Here are the layout managers. You can see that there's a whole number of them. These work different ways. Different ones of these work different ways. I'm going to show you the grid layout. The grid layout basically, well, you'll see in a second, but it basically gives you a row and column kind of a layout where you can park things as long as they're on a row and a column, and it has a set of rules as to what happens if the window gets larger or smaller. Okay. And so you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 window different layout managers. I'm going to pick grid bag, so I click on it and then I move over to my window. You can see it's highlighted. That's where it's going to go if I drop it, and then I click here and it's going to drop my builder, my layout manager into there. Now it doesn't look any different, but now it knows how it's supposed to lay out the elements. Now what I'm going to do is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do labels and I'm going to do text fields. You have all these other things that you can drop on there. You can drop on radio buttons and scroll bars and sliders and tables and all sorts of great things. I'm going to start basic. So I'm going to click a label. And then I come over here. Notice this time it's showing a grid on there. That's because of the layout manager. And it's going to let me decide where to put things. So I'm going to start here. Right? And I'm going to click. And that's going to put a label in there. And I'm going to say something clever like first name. And I'm going to hit enter. And now I'll put first name in. I'm going to take another label. I'm going to put in last name, right? I'm going to put an age in. Age. Okay. This will do for the moment for my purposes, okay? So this is great, but those are just passive labels, okay? And by the way, I can run this. I'll run it real quick for you. I run it the same way I run everything else in Eclipse. I come up here to the run button and I click run, and I think it'll ask me if I want to save it. Yeah, go ahead and save it. And now it'll run it and it'll throw up a GUI window. See a GUI window, and you'll notice this says first name, last name, age. And it'll let me play with some of these things like how it's aligned and what fonts I use and all that good stuff. I'm going to kill this. This panel here has all this sort of information that I can adjust for a label. Okay, so that's all just the way it's like using a word processor. It's just what you want to do with it. Okay, so now we've got this thing defined. How do we get some user data in? Well, I'm going to drop some text fields in. I'm going to drop a text field in here. And I'm just going to hit the return. Oh, you know, it says how many columns. It says how long, and this is 10. Let's go with this for the moment. And now I'm going to grab another one. And I'm going to hit return. And I'm going to do another one for age. And, you know, let's see if I can do a little something with this one. Let's see if there's an easy way to do this. Columns, I'm going to change the columns to be, let's see, max age 909. Let's try about 3. Okay. And I'm going to come back here and hit the enter. I haven't actually tried this changing the length thing before. So let's run it and see what we get. Yeah, save it. Yeah, that didn't do what I thought it was going to do, although it lined age up a lot more nicely now. So that's something that's not exactly what I had in mind. Let me take one more shot at this. And we'll see what goes on here. You can tell what some of these things do. For instance, whether it's editable, what the font is, the horizontal alignment. It seems to me there should be something in here that's going to let us set how big it can be, but I'm not seeing that at the moment. That's the sort of research you have to do. So everyone's like, oh, look how quick and easy this is. It is if you know exactly what you're doing. But of course, with all these options, it requires a little bit of effort. Okay, let's press on. Let's try a couple of things. One, I'm going to try putting a header on this. So I'm going to make that a label, and I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to make that something like my GUI, and I'm going to change the font, I hope, to be larger. Let's try about 18. Okay. Yeah, okay, that worked. So that did what I expected. And we need a submit button. So let me take a J button and drop it here. That's going to become my submit button. Submit. Okay. And it, by default, centers things up. We can control that quite a bit too. Let's run this again. Okay. And you can see I'm making progress. It's not doing anything yet, so if I hit submit, for example, it doesn't do anything. I can fill some text in here because it's editable. Once again, it's not going to do anything with that. Can't yet. So what we need to do is we need some listener callbacks. Now, I don't know if you've used callbacks before, or in general, or specifically. Listeners is how Java does a callback, or does a callback for GUIs, at least for Swing. I think it's become Java FX. Used to be Swing. They're rather similar. But it's what I call the Hollywood principle. The Hollywood principle is don't call us, we'll call you. So you're an aspiring actor, and you want to get a part in a movie, and you call the studio and you say, hey, I'd be great as the leading man for your new movie, and they'll probably tell you, it's great that you think that, don't call us, we'll call you. It's Hollywood principle. So what we have is a function, but you're not going to call the function. The GUI is going to call the function. You're going to define a function that it calls, and you don't know when it's going to get called precisely. It depends on what the user does. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to build a callback, so when the user clicks the submit button, a method gets called, and then we're going to put our code to validate it into that method. So how do we do that? Well, if I double click on submit, right, it's going to pull all this code up. Now, with what we've been doing, you'll notice it's generated all this code. I'll come back to this in a second. So basically, you can see here what's going on. There's a label for the header, right, and it's got all this code. There's a label for first name. It's got all this code. Everything I put on the screen has a block of code, and it's all pretty darn similar code, right? There's not a heck of a lot of difference to any of it. And that's the beauty of a GUI builder, is rather than writing this by hand very tediously, we generate it. Now let's go ahead and add our code. So what happens when we click the button is that we get this method gets called. And what do we want to do when the method gets called? Well, just so that we can see that we're doing something, let's drop a print in here just so you can see that something happens. Okay. We'll work this up in stages. System.out.println. You pressed the submit button. A revelation, right? Okay. So I'm going to save this code. I'm going to run it again. Run. There we go. Now, that's just outputting to the console. The console, of course, in Eclipse is this window down here. So when I click the submit, we're going to see it says you press the submit button. I can press it as much as I want. It'll keep calling that. Okay? So that's the right spot in the code. You'll notice that it's creating this thing and it's attaching it to this button submit, which is has our label submit. Okay. What do we want to do other than print to the console? Well, we probably want to get the different fields, and the different fields are named based on what we called the buttons. Okay. So, for example, let's see. Text field 1, yeah, okay. So the GUI, this is one of these things, since the GUI builder generated these for these and it didn't really understand what I was after, it picked names that might not be the most interesting name. It picked names like text field 1 and things like that. Text field 1, text field 2. You can see here I've got text field, GBC text field 1, right? GBC text field 1, and oh, here it is, text field 1, text field 1. Okay, and there should be a text field 2 somewhere, text field 2, and then we've got do we have a text field 0? Probably. Oh, we're a little more clever than that, are we? So this says, no, that's a label. That's the label stuff. Here's a text field. Let's see if we can find another text field. Yeah. Okay. There's the label for my GUI. Here's first name and yeah. Let's label first name. Oh, here's the text field. Here it is. Text field. Right. Text field 1. Text field 2. Right. Okay. So let's do this. Okay. We're going to get these into some variables. Okay. String first name is equal to text field dot get text. Okay, it's a text widget, so we get text from it. Fair enough. String last name is equal to text field get text. All right. String age. In fact, we call it age string is equal to, whoops, I called it text field, should be text field underscore 1, right? Underscore 1, text field underscore 2, get text, okay. Okay. So just for grins, let's print some stuff out so we can see that we're actually getting, we can feel better, right? Don't you feel better when you get some feedback? I'll tell you, the print statement is your friend. As long as I can have a print, I can debug about anything. I'm occasionally in circumstances where you can't print anything, and that's really tough. That really frustrates me. If I can get a print in there that works, I can live with a lot of difficulty. Debuggers are nice. I tend to put prints in first. There's some problems where they don't work well for, and then you turn to a debugger. Some people do debuggers first. I'm not one of them. So let's run this. And let's see. John, notice I tabbed there to move the screen and make sure this is where you can see it. And we put an age in. All right, we hit the submit button, and down here at the bottom, it prints out our fields. Okay, so we've gotten that correctly. Okay, we can do a little more than that, of course, right? So let's check something like let's put a quick validate in here for age. Let's say I want to make age an int, and I want to call integer.parse int. Right, I'm going to pass in age string, and come on, and I'm going to you know, this is probably really small for you. I probably should have done this several minutes ago, but let me do it real quick now. Preferences on the window, if I can remember correctly. General. Editors. I may not find this. Colors and fonts. Basic. And yeah, I'm close. I think it's this one. Yeah. It's this one. And edit. And let's take about a 16. Okay, and do an apply. And maybe it's this one. Let's edit this one. It's one of these two. About 16. Do an apply. Ah, there it is. Apply and close. That's better. Now you have some chance of seeing what I'm doing. All right. So here's our code that we were just writing. That's much better. So I make it a numeric, and of course it might not be a numeric, in which case I'd need to put in something like a try-catch block. All right. For the moment, we'll assume that they get that part right. Maybe if I have some time, I'll do something else with that. But I'm going to edit check this real quick. I'm going to say if age is less than 0 or age is greater than 150, then I'm going to throw up an alert box, and that's a little verbose in Java. There's probably an easier way to do this, but this will work. Option, pane, show, message, dialog, null, age is out of range. I think that's all I need to say. And if we end up in that situation, then we'll return, rather than going to our statement, let's try this real quick. I'm going to run it, and I'm going to save it, and I'm going to get my window. John, let's put age down as 300, doesn't really matter. And we hit the submit, and you see we get our dialog box, age is out of range. Okay, and so now we're back here. We can change this to something more reasonable. And you can see we print it down here. So that's an example of the kind of validation you're going to do. Right, you're going to have a whole series of validation checks. We should really, because of course if I put in something like 7y, I make a typo mistake, so that's not numeric, right? It's going to blow up down here. That's going to be bad. And so what I need, right, is I need a try catch block around this check in here, right? Try, and then down where here, I think down here, I'm going to have a catch. I'm just going to say exception. It's actually a particular exception, and you could look it up. And what we'll do here is we'll grab this, right? And oh, why aren't you happy? Rename workspace. Oh, I got I'll have to look at that in a second. Why I'm getting an error here. I'm doing something really stupidly wrong. Oh, parameter E. Let's call this something clever like age number exception. Let's see if that's better. Actually, that's happier. Now, I should really make this a particular type of exception, but we're going to play fast and loose here for the moment. And this, of course, everything in my try-catch block should be indented. I think I can move it over like that, all right? It's a little easier to read. And so this is one of the problems is my GUI Builder no doubt had some other exception someplace else, and they called it E. E sort of what you do when you don't really think about what else you do. And they managed to name it in some way that followed through into this, so I had to change my name. This is one of these problems with working with generated code. We'll talk about some more in just a second. So let's try running this. And I did Control S there, so it's already sorted that out. So let's see, John Hunt, age 8I, okay. Right? Age is out of range. Oh, you know what I meant? I meant to say age is not numeric, right? I want to be specific. Now, this still isn't good because numeric is one of those things a programmer would understand, but a person likely wouldn't understand. How about age is not a number, right? Let's go with that, and let's try this again. I did a Control S again, so it just ran on me. And let's see, 8U. It says age is not a number, okay? And I can fix that. 78. And I come down to my print statement. So this shows you what we mean by validation. Okay, a couple of things here that apply to all GUI builders, including Visual Studio. It's generating all this code. That's great. But if I go back to my Design tab and I add some more widgets to this, it's going to write over the top of this, and I'm going to lose all of this work that I did in here. Okay? That's all going to get written over the top of. You want to be careful about that. You can handle that a number of ways. You can do a copy and paste somewhere and copy and paste it back in. But in general, if you got a big elaborate GUI, you got dozens of people working on it, you don't want to do that. So what you typically do is you put all of these things where you write the code into another class, and the only thing you change in the generated code is calls out to your other class. That's pretty typical. There may even be some way to get the GUI Builder to stick those calls in for you. That kind of depends on the GUI Builder. But just in general, you want a strategy for how when you write code, your code does not get written over the top of by the GUI Builder. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of time rewriting and rewriting code. It becomes just as tedious as if you had written it yourself and didn't have to worry about being overwritten. So you want to watch for that. You certainly want to be careful. One way is, of course, to get all of everything you want to do with the screen, get the GUI Builder part all done before you write any of your own code. That sounds good, but of course that assumes that we don't get changes real world. Often the customer looks at our screen and says, yeah, that's a pretty nice screen, but this should be like this. I want this over here. I want this moved there. Things change. And one of the nice things about the GUI Builder is we can just drag and drop the elements around, and we can do that for the user. That's beautiful. But if we don't have a good strategy, then we've got all of this handwritten code to worry about. Now here I only had one place that I had handwritten code in. Needless to say, you can easily get cases where there are a lot more stuff. I think you'll find if you implement, well, I shouldn't say that. It's very easy to get where you have handwritten code in a bunch of places. Okay, so you want a strategy. If you do real work with that, you want some kind of a strategy with that. You might have a class that has a name that starts with this GUI name and then says something like editing code or handwritten code, some naming convention where this is in another class, and then you just come in here to this listener and make a call on that other class. Okay, that's not too bad. Of course, you still have to come in and put those calls back in each time. That's a lot less work than rewriting this whole thing. And you might even find some automated way to do that. Well, this is your exposure to a GUI Builder. They're very powerful, but you know, typically a little course like this, they show you how to do this fancy drag and drop stuff, and we walk away from it, and you don't think about some of these issues like how do I integrate my handwritten code, how do I do validation, things like that. Well, hopefully I've given you enough information that you can spend less than 12 hours getting this to run, and you can do this and have a good time. Watch the video for information on how to put the modules into this. It should pretty much work for you. If it blows up, I would, unless you have a very new version of Java and Eclipse, I would throw all that away, reinstall everything. This is a version with current Java, current Eclipse, current modules, and it works. So that's a pretty good bet. I did this just the last few days. This is May 31st. You won't see this for a couple of weeks, but it'll probably still be good then. Okay, so with that, I'm going to sign off. Hope you have a good time with this. You can shoot me an email if you're having a problem, although I haven't spent a ton of time doing this, so you might be better off doing some Googling, looking at places like Stack Overflow. Certainly widgets, how do I use a radio button widget? I'm not the best sort for that. You can find tutorials on how to do that pretty easily. So looking forward to reading your assignments and seeing what you build. Until then, good night.